Hi, this is Jim Catlin. I'm dubbing this audio after the fact because on the Sunday morning that we recorded this, on September 8th, it turns out that our audio didn't work for the first 10 to 11 minutes of the recording. So I'm going to take some time here at my desk and just speak some simple words about what you're seeing on the screen right here as my PowerPoint goes forward. And then I'll drop out about 10 and a half minutes in when my Sunday morning voice comes back. Anyway, I was talking about the fact that hospitality, which was part and parcel of what we had been doing the day before during Peach Days, was something that we probably misunderstand biblically speaking. We think of hospitality as having a barbecue in the backyard, and it's nice, but it's just not that big a deal. And yet here in Paul's letters to his two up-and-coming pastors, both Titus and Timothy, it turns out he lists this as a very critical issue of qualification for someone who is a respected leader, overseer of the church. And here in the Titus letter, Titus 1:8, he says that these overseers who are going to be watching over the churches need to be hospitable, as well as a lover of good and so much more. And then here in 1 Timothy 3, Paul writes a very similar thing to Timothy in terms of qualifications for this kind of leader to oversee a church body. Above reproach, husband of one wife, sober-minded, self-controlled, respectable, hospitable. There it is, able to teach. It's really a pretty remarkable thing that would show up, because from our perspective, hospitality is something that just seems kind of, what would I call it? It's something that we can do and we like to do, but we don't have to do. I definitely wouldn't place it in the top 10 list of indicators of righteousness, but here it is. It is here. It's a sign of maturity in so many respects. So Paul includes it in both of his advisory letters to his young pastors growing up. And then here Peter writes us in 1 Peter 4 that it's not just an issue of leadership in the church. This is something that's expected of all believers. If you're a believer and God's been sanctifying your heart, it should be a characteristic of who you are. 1 Peter 4:9. Show hospitality to one another without grumbling. Now again, if our idea of hospitality is backyard barbecues with our friends, why would we grumble about it? But the reason that we might grumble about it is because we don't understand hospitality. And this next verse coming up will illustrate that. In Hebrews 13:2, he says, "Do not neglect to show hospitality to strangers, for thereby some have entertained angels unawares." Now, before I get into exactly what the difference in our thinking is, that entertaining angels unawares probably most clearly refers to that episode with Abraham. Remember when he gets visited by those three angels just before they come to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah. And in the passage that you can read in Genesis, it talks about the fact that he entertained them and not really knowing what their credentials were. And here's a picture from our favorite artist, James Tissot, from the 19th century, about Abram's three visitors in Genesis 18. But surely he did really put up a banquet for these guys who were just strangers. And this was not unusual at the time. It turned out that was a very high ethic in ancient cultures, that when strangers come, you really put on a show for them. You really go for it. So what he's saying here, the writer of Hebrews, is that you never know when it comes to strangers. We're talking about people you do not know. These are not friends. These are not relatives. These are just people you've never, ever met before. And in Abraham's case right here, in being hospitable and very gracious to these three guys, he finally learned through the discussions that these were more than just wayfarers coming through his camp. These were actually emissaries of God himself. So that's potentially what could happen. The writer of Hebrews says that wasn't just an ancient possibility during the time of Abraham. It might actually happen during the first century, and I would dare say even up till today. We're never quite aware who we're serving and who we're taking care of when we're generous to people that we don't know. And I might mention that when you're talking about being generous to people you don't know, that also implies the fact that they may never pay you back, which is different than our idea of a backyard barbecue hospitality. Many times it's like, well, you come over to my house this weekend, and then the other person says, yeah, and we'll have you over to our house the week after that. It's kind of an even Steven kind of affair. No, when you're talking about strangers, this may be the only time you ever see them. So the possibility of ever being paid back by them is extremely low. So you give because you're going to give, not because you're going to be paid back. And Jesus himself made exactly this same point in one of his discussions. So here I show the fact I'm striking out the strangers, two strangers here in the Hebrews 13:2 passage, because that word is not in the text. It says don't neglect to show hospitality. So why add the to strangers? Well, precisely because that word hospitality has the stranger element already built into it. And it's an integral part of how the Greek construction from two prior words are put together to make the word hospitality. So it's if you knew the Greek word for hospitality there, you would think it would be redundant to say show hospitality to strangers, because hospitality in this particular use, well, every time it's used, means particularly and without ambiguity, it means to strangers, which explains the grumbling above. See, here's how the Greek word kind of breaks apart. Philoxenia. Philoxenia is really two Greek words put side by side into one word. It's a compound word, which is very common in the Greek language. And in the two component pieces of the compound word, you find out that the stranger issue is actually built into the word. So philoxenia is the noun, and that's the hospitality is the noun. So what are the component parts of philoxenia? Well, if you know a little bit of Greek and you can read the Greek language, which almost nobody does these days because we don't do that, the first part is this word philos. And then the second part is xenos. It looks xenos, but it's xenos. And the philos part, in the first part, it's the same word that you get in brotherly, Philadelphia, philos. It means friend. It means friend. Philos always is translated friend. And the xenos part is always translated stranger. And so this word philoxenia, hospitality, means to be a friend of strangers, someone who befriends strangers. What is your response to strangers whom you've never met? Not friends, not relatives, but total strangers. Do you just put them off? Or do you do something quite generous with them? And that's the hospitality thing right here. Hospitality biblically is always about how you treat strangers. And not just you're nice to them or you refrain from being nasty to them or saying basically you're an other, you're not part of me, you're not like our community, so you're different, I'll treat you differently. It's not a matter of just not doing the negatives against that person. It's all about doing all the positive, about going over the top and really providing for somebody in a gracious, luxurious sense. Not just necessarily not treating them badly, but treating them really quite good in everything. That's the hospitality we talk about. And that's why the grumbling comes up before, because if someone told you, well, you just met a stranger, did you bring them home and have dinner? Did you provide for them in their needs? Were you kind to them? Or did you just sort of refrain from being nasty to them? Biblically, if you go over the top and you're kind and provide for them, that's biblical. That's biblical hospitality. And so that's why it's really an earmark of mature believers, why the overseers that Titus was going to find in the island of Crete, as well as Timothy and what he's doing, those overseers really need to show this as an earmark, because it's an earmark of graciousness. And I think that's what's really important here. Hospitality is grace demonstrated. It's giving to someone that what they don't deserve and what they can't pay you back. It's giving. And of course, God's heart, his character is fundamentally giving in that sense. We talk about God's grace a lot, and we struggle many times to sort of describe what God's grace is. But hospitality it's the physical manifestation of grace from person to person. It's probably, and I think I make this point later in the morning, you'll hear as the audio comes back, but it's more like it's the demonstration of giving, because God's heart is giving, because he always was giving toward us. Okay, well, in a second here, the audio is going to return from Sunday morning, and as it comes back in, let me just get you set up. I talk about the fact that It's over the top. And in my Kentucky relatives, my mom's side of the family comes out of eastern Kentucky. Even still in the very dirt poor Appalachian eastern Kentucky mentality, it turns out then when you would have guests over or friends over, you would provide a massive amount of food, just a massive amount of food. And the rule of thumb was this phrase, 2 or 3. 2 or 3 in terms of meats and vegetables and side dishes and carbs. And, well, you'll hear me talk about that in a second. But it was a wonderful thing that when I would go and be a guest in Kentucky, there was 2 or 3 of everything. It was over the top hospitable. So anyway, here comes the audio from Sunday morning. Sorry about having to splice this in like this, but glad you're listening to this. Let us know how you like these and when you use them. So here you go.
You would have 2 or 3 desserts. So as an adolescent boy, I'm going, let's go to Kentucky. Because, I mean, you would see beef, ham, and chicken on the table. What? Yes. I mean, it was a feast, even for the least person who came as a guest. And this is from people who just can't afford it. They can't afford it. But that's what we're talking about, this kind of thing where you are a friend to strangers and you don't just kind of accommodate them and be nice to them. We're talking about rolling out the red carpet. How is it that God has changed our hearts before Christ where we're looking at strangers and saying, well, they're an annoyance, maybe even a threat? Maybe you got to watch out for those strangers. You don't know what they really want. To where suddenly, naturally, organically, you're saying, I want to befriend them. I want to befriend them. Why? What happened inside of us? So I'm going to spend just 5 minutes to show you what happens, why that's happening, because that dynamic is going on in you, and you'll recognize why in just a second, okay? That's the remarkable change. We need more philoxenia. So maybe our idea of hospitality in terms of just bringing friends to your backyard and having a fun time, maybe it's much bigger and deeper than just that. So let's look why we do this. It's because Jesus himself said this is critical. Now, you remember that scene in Matthew 25? It's the end times. The big judgment is happening. Jesus is separating the sheep from the goats, right? Remember that? And then he says, when he talks to the sheep who've been accepted, they're on the good side, he says basically that you fed me and clothed me. And he says, Matthew 25:35, when I was hungry and you gave me food, I was thirsty, you gave me drink. I was a stranger. See, there it is. I was a stranger and you welcomed me. And he's using this as his primary decision-making for why you're a sheep rather than a goat. Why is it so important about how we treat strangers, is what he's saying. And of course, if you, just to finish the narrative right there in Matthew 25, those who are being judged say, well, when did I do that? When did I do that for you, King of Kings? I mean, I understand that. And he says that this is not only a distinguishing trait, but this is also the fact that I built in you my characteristic as being a friend of strangers. Jesus is judging people based on whether they're displaying actually the very nature and heart of God himself because of how he's transformed us, because of how he's changed us, not because of how we try and earn his respect. So this is the whole deal. Hospitality because we ourselves were once strangers. And that's really what happens here. We ourselves at one time were stranger, and he called us to himself. So when we see strangers, we identify with our pre-Christ lives. Strangers. And let me illustrate a little bit more. We were once strangers is a big deal about us understanding it. And if you go back in the Old Testament, God uses this argument with the Israelites all the time. Why should I treat strangers well when they're traveling through the land? Because you yourselves were strangers. Exodus 22:21. You shall not wrong a sojourner, that's a traveler coming through, or oppress him. Why? Because you were sojourners in the land of Egypt. That was your state at one time. So you need to show compassion on those people because God's shown compassion on you. You understand the mentality of being a loner in a place where you don't fit. A sojourner in a strange place. Have you ever gone to a strange place, like maybe moved to another state or another country? Or you just go, you're in a totally different context. And you don't just visit there, but you move there. You have to figure out how to do the most trivial things, like how do I buy food? And can I talk to the people? Everything is strange to you, and you, by reciprocality, are strange to them. It's extraordinarily disorienting, and you can never seem to rest because even the most trivial things take an enormous amount of work, right? Well, you were in that place in Egypt, God's saying. You were strangers there. So when strangers come into your land and you're the majority in that land, remember what it was like and treat them with great compassion because God has treated you with great compassion. Can you remember when God treated you with that compassion? You need to do the same thing. Because if God's that compassionate while you were a stranger, then if you are God's children with the same heart, you ought to also be compassionate to strangers. See, it fits. There's another one here in Exodus 23. You shall not oppress a sojourner. You know the heart of a sojourner. You were sojourners in the land of Egypt. And I like that clarification. You know the heart part. You know the heart of a sojourner. You understand how it feels when he says heart. You understand the burden emotionally inside. You understand this grotesque feeling every day where you say to yourself, I don't fit here. I don't fit here. And how unsettled you are. That also was your life before Christ. I don't fit here. Something's wrong here. I feel like I'm adrift. I mean, let's capture the emotion a little bit. This heart of a sojourner. You know what this is like. Heart of a sojourner. My nearest example for me was the fact that when I was in high school, from 9th grade through 12th grade, I attended 4 different schools in 4 different states, 4 different places. So every year that I would go from 9th grade to 10th grade, old friends are gone. Everything that was familiar was gone. 10th grade to 11th grade, everything is gone. Friends are gone. Everything's different. 11th grade to 12th grade, everything's different. Old friends are gone. So every time I went, for 4 years in a row, I was a stranger every single year. Now, that's nothing compared to when we talk about strangers from a world perspective. But you've probably experienced this. You know in your gut what it's like to be in a new place and you don't fit. And you feel like a stranger. And you wish, will anyone notice me? Will anyone come to my side and say, I'd like to be your friend? I'd like to befriend you? When I moved to California when I started 12th grade in high school, and that's when I met Dorothy. We met in high school. And it's still working. So when we got there, moving to California to me, and when I started 12th grade, was probably the hardest transition of all those years of transition because I moved from overseas. I moved from England and then moved back to California. I thought I would be going back to the East Coast, which is where I grew up. But instead, the company that my dad worked for moved us to California. And I got to tell you, the transition from East Coast to England was much easier than from England to California, because culturally, California was more culturally different than England was from the East Coast. So coming to California was hard. And I started off as a senior in high school not knowing anybody. And then looking at the California school system and thinking, where am I? And everything was just so foreign. You know California, right? Yeah, it's just really different. So I struggled for a long time and didn't make any connections with anybody. It's very cliquish. Dorothy was in this clique. She wouldn't talk to me. That's not true. Okay. But it was very cliquish until one day in this hotel that my folks and I were staying in short term before I could find a house. This hotel, the Golden Slipper Motel. That's even wrong. I know. So all of a sudden, one day, 2 guys knocked on our door, and you're thinking Mormon missionaries? No, these were 2 again seniors in the high school as well, who were in the Christian group in the high school, and they'd heard about me coming there, and they'd heard that I was a believer, but I wasn't involved in anything. I don't really know how they got my name, but they knocked on the door and they just said, we just wanted to meet you and take you out for a soda or something and just befriend you. And I can't tell you how emotionally impacting that was to me. They came and looked for me in the midst of that loneliness. So what is the heart of a sojourner? That's just a weak example. What's the heart of a sojourner? You know what I'm talking about. You're always feeling like you're an outsider. You feel like there's no community because you're in a foreign community. You just don't fit. You have no community for you, right? You also feel like there's no relatives close by, which there aren't. I mean, many times in ancient cultures especially, if you're in a foreign place, you certainly don't have relatives there. But if you're in a place where your relatives are, at least you You can fall back on them when things are hard, or they'll invite you over dinner. I mean, you always have community if you have relatives in town, right? Unless you grotesquely offended them or something. But I mean, that's usually the case. But here, when we're talking about a heart of a sojourner, no relatives you can fall back on at all. Also, the fact that you have no friends. So not only no community, no relatives, no friends, there is just nobody who is like you, who is willing to befriend you or be kind to you. That they either ought to be or it's natural. It's just not there. And so there's this tremendous sense of having no power over your situation. I'm in a place where I don't even know how things work here. I have no power at all. Maybe someone else could do something on my behalf, but then you realize that you don't have any advocates there because you don't have any friends. You don't have anyone there that understands how things work or what goes on or can even translate what's going on. You have no advocate. You can't do it, and there's no one that can do it for you. And so as a result, you feel extraordinarily alone and very vulnerable. That's the heart of a sojourner. That's the heart of someone who's left behind everything that's familiar, everything that's comfortable, everything that's supportive. That's the heart of a sojourner. And God said, when you get into the land of promise, I'm going to watch you, and you will bend over backwards to befriend the strangers, because at one time you were strangers in Egypt. Do you remember what that felt like? Do you remember what that felt like to be a stranger there? There will be people in your midst. You need to take the initiative and befriend them. Why? Because that's what your God does. He befriends strangers. And this is where we start getting to the issue about why this is so critical, not just for leaders in a church, but for every single one of us that claim Christ as our Lord. He's transformed us, and He's started changing our hearts to not just stiff-arm strangers, but to actually say, I want to befriend strangers. It's a remarkable change. In Leviticus 24, he said, by the way, too, when strangers come into your land, don't do different laws for them. You do the same laws for them. Leviticus 24:22, you shall have the same rule, that's laws, the same rule for the sojourner and for the native. Why? For I'm the Lord your God. Now, why did he say I'm the Lord your God? Did he say that because he says you need to do this, or I'm watching you, I'm in charge, I'm the Lord, I'm your God? No, he's saying you need to do this because that's what I do. I'm the Lord your God. I did this for you. I befriended you when you were strangers. So I'm making that inside you. You need to do that as well. and this is, these get even better. Numbers 15:15. For the assembly, there shall be one statute, one law. Don't pass different laws for people who aren't native Israelites. Be one statute for you and the stranger who sojourns with you, a statute forever throughout your generations. You and the sojourner shall be alike before God. The sojourner, the stranger, what he's saying here, the stranger is not a stranger to God. You are alike in God's eyes, the stranger and you. You have no insider kind of passage in God's countenance. He looks at you and he looks at the stranger alike. Now, in our culture today, we look at us and there's the us's and there's the them's. Us versus them's. And someone who's not like us or them's, and we automatically go to, well, we need to put them off at arm's length. And by the way, we're us's because in so many ways we are slightly superior morally or ethically or something. There's something more right about us, but you don't know about strangers. So we end up separating ourselves and dividing ourselves based on this kind of stranger, non-stranger ethic. And what he's saying right here is, no, in God's eyes, you and the stranger are alike. God is no respecter of persons, even though you call yourself an Israelite. You and the stranger from God's eyes are exactly the same. And so you need to treat the stranger as equally as you treat your Israelite neighbor. That's a huge indictment against our culture, where we tend to go right now. And I mean, in just us personally, there's a way in which we look at a stranger who maybe dresses differently or speaks differently, or it's just different, that we know that clearly there's enough telltale signs to say they're not one of us. But when we say they're not one of us, we distance them. I do. I mean, it's just a natural response. But from God's perspective, he looks at both of us and says, neither one of you are strangers to me. And neither one of you has an elevated position with me. And so when we as be transformed creatures, transformed hearts. We see strangers. Something inside of us says the heart of God loved me when I was a stranger. And the heart of God replicated in me loves strangers. It's a natural transformation. So what we do on Peach Days isn't because of the giant O word ought. We ought to do it. We do it because God himself called us when we were strangers. And that thrills our hearts. Like when Jeff and Andy came and knocked on my door at the Glass Sliver Hotel. We came looking for you. For me? Yeah. And that kind of initiative that takes the love to go to someone who's isolated and alone and without resources, without power, is one of the most beautiful demonstrations of the grace of God. Now, we talk a lot about the fact that it's difficult to describe to people in common words, what is grace? What is grace? And we'll say, well, grace theologically is what God gives us that we can't earn and we don't deserve. Okay, I understand that. But what is grace? What is grace? When Andy and Jeff knocked on my door and said, we're here for you. We've looked for you. Why? Because I deserved it? Well, not really. Why? Because I was such a great guy to have a social thing with? No. But in our loneliness, my loneliness, the grace of God is what God does on your behalf to come to you, to bring you to him, and you do not deserve it. But everything about you goes, yes, I have been included when I don't deserve it. And from a spiritual perspective, we have been included in the family of God when we don't deserve it. We've gone from being strangers to being part of the family of God. And so we've fallen in love with that ethic of calling people who are strangers to be our friends. Because it's the most beautiful thing I can think of. What is grace? When God brings you his love when you're least expecting it and you never deserved it. That's grace. That's grace. And you can't earn it. Just two more verses here. Wow. Cursed be anyone who perverts the justice due to the sojourner, the fatherless and the widow, and all the people shall say amen. So he includes all the powerless people right there. The sojourner, the stranger, the fatherless, the orphans who have no one to advocate for them, the widow who has no husband to advocate for her. These are all the powerless people. God says, I saw you as powerless people and I came to you in my grace. You, when you see powerless people, need to go to them and take initiative and display my grace I displayed to you to those who have no power. It's a beautiful thing that God does when he does that for us. And finally, Deuteronomy 10:18. He executes justice for the fatherless, for the widow, and loves the sojourner, giving him food and clothing. So, 19, love the sojourner, love the stranger. Therefore, for you were sojourners in the land of Egypt. So we're going beyond just being hospitable and inviting someone over for dinner. You need to love strangers. And so that's why we serve water and popcorn. Because we love strangers. We love people we don't know. We want them to understand the grace of God in the most fundamental, pragmatic way that we can think of. And how do you do that? By giving them something they don't deserve, but they completely appreciate. When people come in for popcorn, that's usually kids whose eyes light up. It's like for free, It's just a great thing. But when the adults come over to the water and they're dying of thirst, if you're ever here manning the water table, so many people come and say, oh, thanks for doing this. And you can hear in their voice, why are you doing this? Who is it? Someone told us you go down the street and you can buy the same bottle of water for $4. $4. $4. Wow. Really? Yeah. $4. So we gave away $16,000 of water yesterday. What? We mean we could have... No, stop that. But you see when people receive what they don't deserve and what they don't expect, and it's so loving, they don't know what to do with that. That's the grace of God demonstrated in action. That's the grace of God in action. We don't have to worry about kind of trying to figure out theologically how to explain grace. Grace is what you receive when you don't deserve it. Do we have examples? Yeah, it happened right here at the water table, hundreds of times yesterday. People receive grace and they understand grace because he's changed your heart to love what grace does. And so you can't stop yourself from befriending strangers. Remember, you were at that time separated from Christ, Paul writes. You were alienated from the commonwealth of Israel, strangers to the covenants of promise, having no hope and without God in the world. Great example of what it is to be before Christ. No hope because you're a stranger. You're a stranger to what God has promised. 13, but now in Christ Jesus, you who were once far off have been brought near by the blood of Christ. That is such a heartwarming statement. We were before Christ strangers to the goodness of God. And everything about life seemed to pull us left and right into pointless dead ends in life. It didn't seem to satisfy. That was our life before that. But now, after Christ, you've been brought near into the community of God himself, the family of God itself. You understand what it was like to be a stranger from God. And then he knocked on your door and said, I want you to be part of my love for you. And you went, me? Why me? I don't deserve this. No, you don't. But that's what grace is all about. The grace of God comes knocking. That's what it's all about. Later he says, look, so then you're no longer strangers and aliens, but you are fellow citizens with the saints, members of the household of God. And that's our story as well. This is how God has brought us in from being strangers. And so our hearts leap at the idea of doing the same thing for other people who are strangers. You befriend them. Why? Because God befriended us. That's why. That's why. It's become part of who we are. And Romans, Paul says, indeed, he says in Hosea, those who are not my people, I will call my people. And her who is not beloved, I will call beloved. You went from being strangers to being his people. The transformation is all over the Bible. And so that's why hospitality, befriending strangers, is a key trait of God. And as he transforms you, it's a key trait of you. And that's why we can't stop ourselves making popcorn. Matthew 25. Here's the end of that statement of the judgment. When he did see you, when did we see you a stranger and welcome you, or naked and clothe you? This is the sheep and the goats. And Matthew 25, verse 40, he says, the king will answer them, truly I say to you, as you did it to one of the least of these, my brothers, you did it to me. So God's remaking our hearts to be generous, to be full of grace, and to want to befriend strangers because he befriended me when I was a stranger. We could say this all morning, but this is a key trait. This isn't like the barbecue picture at first, which is it's just nice to be hospitable and probably optional. No. As God's remaking you, he's making you like him. And it's a key trait of God because this is the working out of the grace of God in the pragmatic details of life. He demonstrates giving when it's not deserved. So I thought I'd just finish with this. Robinson wrote a great song called Come Thou Fount of Every Blessing. He wrote this song when he was 22, by the way. And he didn't write a song, he wrote a poem. And it was later put to music. But one of the verses says this, Jesus sought me when a stranger, wandering from the fold of God, he to rescue me from danger, interposed his precious blood. So that's been our experience when he came to us as strangers and brought us to himself. And for us, it's the most beautiful act we can think of, is to befriend a stranger and give to them what they don't deserve and they can never pay back, because that's exactly what God has done for us. It's grace in action, not an optional barbecue in the backyard. It's grace in action. That's hospitality. So I wish we could use a different word in the Bible than hospitality, because that's just too soft a word. But when you think of a friend of strangers, that's it. Philoxenios. We need more of that philoxenios. Okay, let's pray and then we'll sing our way out this morning. Father, thank you for this very full morning. Thank you for the vision of reaching out your gospel in Southeast Asia. Thank you for an understanding of how you're reaching out to our youth. Thank you for a deepening understanding of how you're reaching out in very simple actions we take during Peach Days, so that your grace is not only demonstrated, but it's made alive in how we treat those that come who we don't know. And God, I pray that because of all those things that people received yesterday at Peach Days, that your Spirit might tap on their hearts and say, why would they do this? Why would they spend all day doing this? And this must have cost them money. And I don't deserve this, but there they were. So God, I pray that we would not be glorified, that you would be glorified, that people would come to understand that we have a God who so freely gave to us, and when we least expected it, in our loneliness and in our isolation, came knocking on our door and said, I'm here to befriend you. So Father, I pray that somehow your Spirit would bring that message to those who very simply experienced your grace by the giving out of water and popcorn. So thank you for what you do in and through us. May you be glorified in all of those things, and may your grace be manifest in everything we do. So thank you in Jesus' name. Amen.